So I'm Steve Winter, and I'm a political theorist over in the politics department. Just to let you know a little bit about where I come from. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, originally. Most New Zealanders are very good at picking the accent, so you guys probably knew that already. I lived high up on the side of Grouse Mountain, and right next to the salmon-heavy waters of the Capilano River. So that's where I hail from. From there, I went to Dalhousie, Canada, the other coast of Canada. Did some university work there. From there to Oxford, on the side of the Thames, or the Isis as we call it there. And then I came here about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and I've worked here since then. So when Jeremy, where's Jeremy? There he is. So Jeremy pops into my office about, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and says, you guys are going to hold this little shindig, and wondered if I might be involved and what I might be able to contribute. I thought to myself, well, look, one thing I might be able to do is talk a little bit to the Canadian experience, the constitution under which I grew up, and maybe what kind of information that might be useful for New Zealanders going forward. I'm really uncomfortable with the "we New Zealander yet" thing. I'm still working through that. So when I switch back and forth, I'll try not to use "we" because I don't know what I mean when I say "we" if I'm talking about Canada or if I'm talking about here. So I'll say "you New Zealanders," but I kind of, it's been a while now. Might even apply for citizenship one day. All right. So I was asked to Jeremy to see what I might be able to contribute. All right. So I said, look, I thought, well, you guys are going to know a lot about the Bill of Rights from the United States, and you might be familiar with the Human Rights Act in England, Britain, and but maybe the Canadian thing might be really useful to you. And moreover, this is going to be really useful because the influence of Canadian charter jurisprudence has been incredibly profound in New Zealand. Right? It's not entirely the case that you guys plagiarized the charter when you wrote the Bill of Rights Act. It probably could use some footnotes, though, right? And but there are some differences. And I'll talk a little bit through a couple of those differences. I'm going to focus on one particular difference when I get the notwithstanding, what's called the notwithstanding clause in Canada. I'll say a little bit about what that is. Okay. As we get through there, I want to develop the idea that I'm so bad with names. Ron, Mark, the guy with the blue blazer, Reginald. No, what's your name? So, Royden. The idea of constitutional dialogue, Royden, that was introduced by Royden.
It's a trick name.
Yeah, it's nothing like Mark. Whatever. So bad at it. But the thing is, I keep trying and failing and trying. Okay, so let's just some reflections, though. Okay, why might we look across each other's borders to look and see what's going on elsewhere? There might be lots of reasons. The first reason people do this constitutional comparison kind of stuff is they look for best practice elsewhere. They look for lessons, right? What kinds of things they might be able to do better. They also look for problems they might be able to avoid. They look to be able to make predictions about what would happen if we do things here that we have done elsewhere, or alternative predictions if we fail to do things here that have been done elsewhere. Or we try to explain past events. Now, much of, as I said, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act was derived, in some cases, from the Canadian Charter. I'll just point out some major differences. Okay, so whereas Canada's document is a piece of constitution, it's entrenched, to use your language, right? Though the way we entrench things is different. That's a we Canada we entrench things is different than the way we New Zealanders entrench things. Whereas, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act is an ordinary act. Furthermore, Canada permits the courts to nullify legislation. New Zealand courts cannot. Now I'm just going to stop and pause there, because those two things are very different, but they often get run together in conversation. So people say, we don't want to have a supreme law kind of thing in the Bill of Rights Act. And by that they often mean entrenchment. But you could have an entrenched constitution that didn't permit strong judicial review, the power of nullification, and you could have powers of judicial nullification that are not supreme law. It's important to keep those things different because you might want one but not the other. There may be problems associated with one that are not associated with the other. Canada's charter has specific protections for Indigenous rights. There's another difference from the New Zealand one and something to think about. And but you guys have protections against the coercive imposition of medical treatment, which Canada doesn't have. So there's an addition there. We just have to rely on the security of the persons. That's a we Canada way. So, there's some of the differences. I want to talk about another difference. And this is more not to do with the provisions of the Act, or provisions of the Charter, but rather the way in which it exists in the polity. Okay? So, back in the day, this is how the story goes. The Constitution of Canada was built on, to borrow a line that was used last night, on the "don't ring us, we'll ring you" model of government, yes? And so it was a very hierarchical structure and something like that, right? And so then the charter started rolling through the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. And the idea that we could have a piece of the Constitution that would embody citizenship rights got some legs. And a really prescient fellow guy named Alan Cairns came along and argued, look, this charter is going to represent a fundamentally new way of understanding the Canadian polity. It's going to represent a new political vision of a Canadian constitution in which Canadians are not primarily subjects of law, but rather citizens whose status as such will be embodied in that charter. The horizontal version of the party politic rather than a vertical one. Subsequent scholarship and commentary has basically borne out Alan Cairns' prediction. It would be too much to say that the charter caused this change in constitutional understanding, but it's fair to say that it embodies that development. This partially explains its popularity. At the Charter's 25-year anniversary in 2007, lots of surveys were done, 60% of Canadians thought the Charter was, quote, moving the country in the right direction, end quote. Only 12% disagreed. And the province in which it was most popular is Quebec, which is an interesting thing. We'll come back to that in a bit. In 2012, Canada marked 30 years of the Charter, and there was more online surveys, but I don't trust online surveys, so I won't give you that. But basically, everybody is still really happy, right? So, numbers in excess of 70%, right? Parliamentarians don't even fantasize about being that popular. They get excited about 40% approval rates. That would be wow, right? But the Charter is really popular. But that's not to say there hasn't been a backlash, particularly amongst what we might call a conservative group of academics. Interesting, it used to be the left that was opposed to these things, now it's more right-wing. But those people who criticize the Charter as an anti-democratic check on the popular will must confront the plain truth that the Charter is what the people want. And that wasn't true in the 70s. It wasn't that we built on some great demand for a Charter, right? This is something that's come out of it. I want to focus the remainder of my remarks on the part of the Canadian Constitutional Odyssey that may have some bearings going forward here in New Zealand. For the big difference in Canada, the strong power of judicial nullification, the power of the court to strike down, to nullify primary legislation, is linked to what I'm going to talk about today, the notwithstanding clause. So the notwithstanding clause allows the Canadian Parliament, or any of the Canadian parliaments, to carry forward with legislation notwithstanding the fact that the court has declared it inconsistent with the Charter, essentially. Right? So you can do it, they can do it anyways. There's some other provisions, it's only 5 years long and so on. Right? But that's often pointed at as a way in which Canada's strong judicial review is weakened. And then there's some debate. And the debate goes on. And we're going to go on to this debate in a second here. About whether this really makes Canada's judicial review any less strong. Usually the judgment is no, it doesn't. But given the possibility of New Zealand at least canvassing the idea of nullification power for the judiciary, I want to offer two cheers for a notwithstanding clause, at least one that's suitably amended. This may seem like a rather odd line of argument, for unlike the grandiose popularity of the Charter, the notwithstanding clause is not very popular at all. It is seen as a stain on the otherwise perfect principled document. It's often described as a compromise of pragmatic politics with an otherwise a principled document. And the reason why, if you'll permit a short Canadian history anecdote, who doesn't like Canadian history anecdotes, right? Right? It was the product of a last-minute negotiation between the Anglophone provincial premiers and Jean Chrétien, who was the Prime Minister's main fixer during the constitutional negotiations in 1982, which, by the way, I'll note, wasn't a revolutionary moment. We did the Canadian Constitution thing in the absence of any crazy revolutionary thing. So those people who want to put the two together, this is a rather odd case for you. Though I do think we were undergoing it was a transitional period. And I think that those transitional periods can be easily seen here in New Zealand, and Wayne Mapp talked about it a bit today. So, René Lévesque, who was the Premier of Quebec, was really opposed to the idea of a constitutional charter, because he saw this as centralizing, more powers to the central government meant more power for the Anglos, less power for the French, and in Canada, the debate about French and Anglo politics is the key division, right? So, He was, so it was seen as a fix, a last-minute fix that was going to get the provinces on side for the charter. And in order to get the provinces on side, we needed to stick in this possibility, this compromise of principle with power. All right? Everybody thought it was a bad idea. René Lévesque described the charter as a knife in the back. Pierre Trudeau, the driving force behind the charter, said that the clause, quote, violated my sense of justice. All right. Now, part of the reason now that the notwithstanding clause is so unpopular is not just its origin as a last-minute kitchen cabinet deal, but it also has to do with the larger connection with French-Canadian separatism. French-Canadian separatism is not very popular in English Canada. You could characterize it as an unpopular position. Okay? Anglo-Canadians hate French separatists. They're not overly keen on French-Canadians, full stop. But separatists, it's a weird love-hate relationship. We don't want them to leave, but we can't have them stay. You know, it's really strange. So the point being is that it's not French-Canadian separatism. They really don't like them. And you may be aware that there's large numbers of French Canadians who want to leave Canada and separate and have their own country. And there's been a series of referendums on this and so on. So as part of that, separatist governments get elected in Quebec. And one of the separatist governments in the 1980s had this pro-English language policy. I'm really simplifying things, right? And part of that policy was French language education in the schools. And the policy of French language only education in the schools was subject to a charter challenge. Right? So it was going to violate freedom of expression. And in 1989, the Supreme Court declared the policy, the French language school policy, to be in contravention of the principles of the Charter. And so Quebec, what did Quebec do? They used the notwithstanding clause. Actually, Quebec had used the notwithstanding clause for all of their legislation up till now, but this was the one that pissed everybody off, right? And it became associated, the notwithstanding clause became the kind of thing that was associated with the perfidious French, right? So the separatism and the notwithstanding clause got all mixed up, right? And it was about what was wrong with French Canada was the fact that they were a bunch of rights violators, right? So you had this strange thing that happened simultaneously. Anglo outrage at this heavy-handed, anti-French thing going on, right? About Quebec infringement. Both at the same time was channeled through the Charter. What was wrong with it was the violation of Charter rights. So the use of the notwithstanding clause was what damaged it showed sort of how bad the French were, but at the same time elevated the Charter into the realm of the iconic and the stratosphere. Right? This was the sacred text, which we knew it was sacred because we knew that what the evil was, and they were the ones who were violating the sacred, right? So there's our Canadian history. That'll be on the test at the end of the day. So that's why a little bit of story why Section 33 is seen as an illegitimate clause. And it may require some explanation then as to why somebody might stand up here and say, actually, it's not a bad idea. And indeed, even encourage we New Zealanders to think about it. Okay, so let's step back. Often it's said in these cases, if you're going to have a judicial nullification power, that you are in the midst of a bind. Either the Parliament or the courts are going to have the last word on something. This is a false dichotomy. We're not you don't need to have either a electoral dictatorship or a cabinet dictatorship or a judicial dictatorship, right? And a lot of people have been trying to think through this false dichotomy, right? Think through via media, something more sophisticated. And there's a lot of people working on this. I'm just going to point to some thoughts by a woman named Janet Libert in a 2009 essay on the idea of compromise. And she works through the story of compromise that I just told, but said there are other ways to think about the notwithstanding clause under the idea of compromise. To think about the use of the notwithstanding clause by Parliament as compromised visions of rights, as a way of compromising articulations of ways of thinking, of interpreting rights. This idea of using the notwithstanding clause to bring the Bill of Rights back from the courts and putting it in Parliament, making Parliament at the center of articulating rights policy. It's a vision in which parliaments are not seen as the enemy of rights, of legislating despite rights or against rights, right? And the judges on the other side are the stalwart defenders. But instead, parliaments playing an important role in realizing rights. For defenders of this approach, parliaments are the place where competing claims of right can be articulated and where compromises between competing goods hammered out. And here you might think, well, we don't need Canada's notwithstanding clause because there's some problems with it we'll identify. But maybe something reworked like a notwithstanding clause, might focus on the parliamentary prerogative to specify other interpretations of rights in the face of a judicial nullification. So authors in this political rights tradition often point to New Zealand institutions as models, though those of us who live here may not recognize the glass that's being held up to us. I think there's good reasons to strengthen the hand of the courts here in New Zealand, because the current system, I think, is not working. And I wonder if I'll say maybe a little bit why I think it's not working, just as an aside. It's a shame that not everybody who was here last night is here again, because last night we got some rather Panglossian visions of the New Zealand situation. And today we've heard a much less Panglossian vision. And people have talked about serious rights problems around disability, around the foreshore and seabed, around the right to protest, around prisoner compensation, internal spying. I'd add the independent kingdom of Christchurch. And the Hobbit Amendment. These are all questions about which these are rights questions right now. And these are not being well addressed. It's not obvious that they're being well addressed here. And more fundamentally, even if we didn't have these specific problems, we may think that it's a legitimating function of a piece of a constitution that citizens have the right to challenge the exercise of arbitrary power, even if it's never exercised, even if you've got the most fantastic government in the world. This is why the Vatican will never have such a thing, because it's always going to be perfect there, right? But even if you've got the most perfect government in the world, right, the power to challenge the use of arbitrary power is still a legitimating function. Okay, so I wonder if a compromise inclusion of a notwithstanding clause might not be seen not as a stain on the project of creating a more legitimate form of government, a more perfect union, but instead offer a via media between two competing traditions of right promotion. So this brings me to some reflections. First off, I don't think the current structure is good enough here. If you want to develop a dialogue between the courts and the Parliament, you've got to give the courts a strong say in the matter. Inconsistency might be good enough. Maybe. But so far, it doesn't look good. All right? And moreover, if you brought a power of judicial nullification in here with an amended notwithstanding clause, New Zealand would be unlikely to suffer the birth pangs that it had in Canada. You guys don't have a massive linguistic divide that is structured around a separatist thing as we do in Canada. Though I understand that the New Munster Party periodically makes motions about South Island separatism, I don't know, who knows, they might get this under they can run with it. That was a rugby thing anyways. All right, so in Canada, the odium under which the notwithstanding clause operates means it's difficult for parliaments to use. This might not be seen as such a problem here. Here you've got much more of a tradition of parliaments, telling the courts where to go. All right? If you do that, I think it would be wise to remove the ability of the preemptive strike from parliaments. Right now, basically New Zealand has a notwithstanding clause, and they use it all the time. And they just preemptively say, look, we're going to legislate notwithstanding inconsistencies with the Bill of Rights. But if you remove that and force the Parliament to react to the judiciary, so the judiciary says no go, and Parliament has to go back and then respond and say, yeah, we're going to do it anyways. So you structure the dialogue. Maybe the Parliament changes the legislation in order to, though it's more rights respecting, which happens a lot in Canada, right? Or, in some cases, the Parliament has a different interpretation of rights, right? And it's also a reasonable interpretation of rights. And in which case, such a notwithstanding clause would permit the Parliament, exercising its democratic authority, to proceed, despite what the court says. But there we have a dialogue between institutions, okay? Not a monologue, as so often is the case here. Moreover, this would be flexible. If we get it wrong once, it's not locked down forever, which is why I think we need to distinguish between review powers and entrenchment, right? In Canada, we've got the case where we've got both. In the United States, we've got the case where we've got both, and it's very difficult to fix things once they're broken. Here New Zealand has a great history of constitutional flexibility, and I mean that in the best possible way, all right? Getting it wrong and being able to put it right. But moreover, when the courts get it wrong, Parliament will have the onus to put it right. because having such a clause will force Parliament to be able to answer the question, why didn't you act? In Canada, it's, oh no, the courts have said it, that's what the rights must be. But we know that the courts get it wrong sometimes. And a notwithstanding clause would make sure that both parties remained party to that constitutional dialogue. And that, I think, is something that we could seriously consider pursuing. Thank you.